When I came to know about the grant, I was already doing this project and I was nearly 1 year down. Before that, I didn't think of it as much of as expansive as it is at this moment. In the beginning, I thought that there are some areas of practice that I want to explore for my own education, because I didn't go to any photography school or I never attended any workshop. I'm totally self-taught. There are certain aspects which is kind of difficult to get into if you are not under any institution. For example, I used a large format camera for the first time when I did this project. Before that, I had no access to it. And I learned to develop my own film. I learned to make my own prints. So a lot of ambitions of learning some technical craft drove me into making this idea about making a collection of photographs that would be placed in different points in history, adapt the necessary techniques to recreate that kind of photography. Initially, it started out with that, but after I got the grant, then I thought that maybe I could expand it into a narrative. The narrative existed before, but narrative in terms of storytelling, in terms of printing technology, in terms of handwriting, in terms of how reproductions are represented in a second layer of reproductions, things like that. These things I included after I got the grant. In the next 3 years, the things I was like consuming, cinema or literature or in television, I took elements from things I liked, put them into it. That's kind of how we went about it. So
one of the things that I found curious is the story. I guess the narrative is about these old photo studios that exist and sort of what is their afterlife going to be in one sense. Can you refer a little more to what that narrative is? How did you sort of want to approach this idea of older photo studios and being elided by digital culture, the larger culture of these things becoming obsolete with the passage of time?
As a matter of fact, the characters and the persons that are referenced in the prologue of the book, where I write as myself, going to an old studio and digging up old equipment, like magically stumbling into a diary sort of thing. Except for the finding the diary part, a similar incident actually happened. There was this studio near Bowbajar in Calcutta, which was supposed to shut down. And I know a person like this who restores and collects old cameras, and he repairs them and he sells them. So I went with him one time. The description that you see of the studio, so it kind of resembles that. Rest of it is absolutely fictional.
I guess at all points of times you were kind of going not between two polar entities, which is sort of fiction and reality, but also what people now call, something speculative fictions, which is possibilities of fiction within the documentary itself. When you were trying to simulate, say, older printing technologies, or when you were trying to simulate what images look like in the past, what were your sources of information? What particular tropes were you hoping to, recreate? The tension, that we find interesting. How do you create authorial voice within this idea of simulation on the one hand, but also recreation on the other? What were the challenges of that, perhaps, for you?
To be honest, the idea influenced by writers like Borges and Roberto Bolano, that they put real things into a fictional context, and they absolutely fictional things among various real artifacts. Thus, they kind of create something which feels like that they should belong to a historical narrative, but the outrageous plot lines of their stories like make the viewer sure that this can't be real. I like the dichotomy between that. From there, I went to the way of like photographing and making a photograph look like it's been taken a long time ago. The primary challenges that I found that it is easy to like mimic the clothes, mimic the surroundings, and giving some digital post-production technique to make the photograph look like, like faded and like torn and stuff like that. Those are easy things to do. But the challenges that I faced was like making the subject, them appear to acknowledge the camera like they did back in, say, 1920s. If I take a large format camera and place it in front of a subject right now, the way the subject will acknowledge the camera and the kind of familiarity, the burden of like photographic history that is there in a photograph of taken in 1920s, for example, will not have the same, especially of people who are not used to being photographed. That kind of relationship with the camera and with the photographer and with the surroundings, that kind of, when a subject sees a big camera for the first time and the subject doesn't know what it does, what exactly it does, to be precise, I found that harder to emulate.
In a way, what you're talking about is how you performed real. But at the same time, when you're trying to look at the history of representation, making someone believe in that moment of encounter, because you're fictionalizing that narrative, is precisely the kind of freedom you have from context. That means you can change the relationship we have with the camera and the burden of representation that our history comes with. I guess the question is, were you trying to and were you able to move away from what we quintessentially understand as the history of representation in India?
What I try to do is creating a different purpose for looking at a set of photographs. In most of the times when we are encountered with a set of photographs, say as a book or a slideshow or a series or an exhibition, there are mostly three purposes. In a broader sense, the purposes are like, you try to find information, whether the set of photographs are narrating some kind of event. When a stranger encounters a set of photographs taken of different people, what they look at is an information about culture, information about a historical event, some kind of knowledge. The second thing is, if the purpose is advertising a product or advertising an idea, the photographs are not meant to be consumed in face value, or rather the photographs are meant to be consumed as an accompanying piece to something else which is being advertised in here. And the third is, the photographs are consumed strictly as an art object in terms of like composition and lighting and all technical and craft part of it. Beyond these three, what I wanted to do in this book, that I wanted the reader to look at these photographs to find something else in it. The initial idea would be that when you encounter these set of photographs, you won't be looking at the historical and cultural parts of it. You won't be looking at its composition and its lighting and stuff like that. Or you won't be looking at the products or the objects that are there, but you would try to find something else. Encounter this set of photographs in this particular context would not require the viewer should already have a sense of history or artistic understanding or some kind of like knowledge that makes them privileged in a way.
What was the sort of binding element for you of arriving at this particular format? And now I'm talking quite technically, this size of book, this kind of layering on the cover. Did you do a lot of dummy making, for instance, in order to arrive at this format?
After I completed all the content in terms of the individual contents like the prints and the photographs and the individual documents and stuff like that. So I was working with my designer collaborator, Soumyadip Ghosh. He and I, after a lot of brainstorming and discussions and trials and errors, we decided that the journal section should not look like it is made by an artist, to be precise. The journal should look like it is put together by a meticulous, methodical, but a layman, somebody who has no artistic intention. So in order to arrive that, we had to go through a couple of phases of making dummies, in terms of deciding the color of the line, how the dates and all that stuff is like printed on the diary page. And there are so many frames and layers in a particular page. There is the page of the diary and there is the markings of the date and there is a quote running underneath and there is a print pasted on it, and the print has its own boundaries. Maybe the print is reproduction of a reproduction. So the difficulty that I faced was like making the prints appear that they are the center of the attraction, yet keeping all the elements without making them too clumsy and chaotic.
Does this book have a political tenor that you are trying to look at as well? I mean, and what would be the politics of its representation for you?
In the book, I consciously avoided particular kind of looking. The book contains photographs by variety of fictional photographers. What I try to maintain is that the difference between the photographer and the subject in terms of social class, in terms of race, in terms of privilege, to be encapsulated all. What I consciously try to do is not to keep that difference very prominent. Most of the photographs that are there are taken by people and of people who belong to the same category, like either it is taken by a family member or they are taken by professional studio photographer, but unknown, not like a British or a colonizer or somebody who would take the photograph of particularly someone for their exotic nature or giving it some kind of social documentary. The inherent biases that are there in that kind of photographic practice, that I try to avoid in most of the photographs that are there. Also, since the photographer and the subject in most of these photographs, they already know each other from beforehand, so the camaraderie that they both have, I wanted to bring that out mostly in older times, before smaller cameras and came into middle class and lower middle class households, before they became really popular.
Well, that's interesting in terms of what you didn't want to sort of overlap with, or you didn't want to associate with in kind of a representational trope. What were the sort of tropes you were willing to associate with? What were the kind of influences that had an impact on you?
In this book, there are many real photographers whose photographs I tried to emulate, not just in terms of composition and lighting and all that technical craft part, but also in terms of relationship with the subject. Among those references, I am a huge sucker of old family albums. Whenever I go to somebody's place, if I spot some like old photographs like hanging around in a frame in a wall, I go up and if I like it, I like make inquiries. But also not just like unknown family photographers, like known names. Pablo Bartholomew. There is a photograph in this book which I like blatantly kind of paid a homage because it's a very favorite photograph of mine. What I really love about it is that photograph is not made for any particular purpose. It's only a coincidence that the photographer in that particular case is somebody like Pablo. If you take his name out, it's just one friend photographing his other friends. In terms of older photographers, when I got into the history of the photographic practice of Bengal before independence, I came across a few names, found them at the Center for Social Studies. Photographers like Arjun Kumar Chaudhuri, photographers like Chanchalawala Dashi, Annapurna Datto. Their imagery had a very formal purpose of composition and pictorial value. Some of them were studio photographers, some of them were like hobbies who were mostly interested in techniques but didn't pursue photography professionally. When I referenced their photographs for this book, I wanted to like run a certain line of personal connection, which is my fictional invention in this, to tie the whole thing together. The book is a story of people who had a personal connection with a particular person or a person who looked like, or various persons who look the same.
What's very interesting, I think, about publications like these is a kind of consciousness of viewership. People who look at photographs. You obviously had to put on different hats. You had to sort of engage with different personalities, maybe inhabit them. You produced this book for a certain viewership, maybe today. But on the other hand, throughout, you had to also inhabit a viewership yourself of images. Yes. I'm just looking at an interesting cross of those things happening.
If I see a famous photographer's work on the internet or like a photographic essay, so it already has a prejudice or a bias when it reaches out to me. I not only consume the work, I also consume the writings and the opinions and the stature that is present inherently. But when you encounter a family album at somebody's home, you only know the person, you know the family, but you don't know the photographer, you don't know the information that you have is not of the photographer or the photography, but of the subjects that inhabit those photographs. If you knew it. If it's a completely stranger's, then the fun is even more. What exactly I would find interesting in these photographs When I try to identify it, it already gives you the scope to be different people in terms of photographers. So I try to utilize that opportunity in terms of reimagining what kind of person I am